This episode is sponsored by Linode. Linode is offering listeners of this podcast a $20 credit, which is good for 4 free months at their lowest plan. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for $5 a month. You can get your servers in any of their 10 data centers, and their high memory plans start at 16 gigabytes. Get a server running in under a minute. They do hourly billing with a monthly cap on all plans, and add-on services like backups, node balancers, Longview, etc. VMs for full control, running Docker containers, encrypted disks, VPNs, etc. You can run a private Git server. They provide native SSD storage, 200 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. They have 24/7 friendly support, even on holidays, and a 7-day money-back guaranteed. So go check them out at linode.com/RubyRogues. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel we have David Richards.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv. This week we have a special guest, and that's Aaron Sumner. Aaron, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hi.
We haven't had you on the show before. Do you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm a longtime Ruby developer, mostly Rails. I've been writing in a blog called Everyday Rails since sometime in 2010, and I think most people know me for a book about testing Rails with RSpec that spun out of that blog.
Nice. Yeah, we're having you on because I ran across one of your articles about replacing RSpec controller tests and things like that. Do you want to just kind of give the impetus to that, and then we can start talking about sort of the blend between not testing controllers, but testing controllers and moving stuff out of controllers?
Yeah, so the blog post in particular there were two in the series before that were about a year earlier, and it was right after Rails 5.0 got announced. And there was the part of that announcement was that controller tests were going away. Not in those terms, but yeah. But so if controller tests are going away, how do you test your controller code? And so I just started a couple of options to basically go higher up. So using RSpec terminology at the time, like a feature spec that would go through the that would go through the browser, or a request spec that would test like API levels, so a little bit closer to the controller code without the browser UI details. And one of the comments that came out of that was, but a controller test is the only way I can reliably test my code. And my kind of flip comment at the time was, your code might be in the wrong place then. And I just kind of left it at that, and then revisited it because I noticed that, I don't like writing controller tests that much either, and had found myself moving away from it and just taking some time to figure out what I was doing differently, and is that it was a good pattern to follow going forward. And so, yeah, the blog post that came out of that was, there are a lot of different ways a lot of places to put code that gets run from a controller, a lot of different ways to test it. Here's kind of a high level look at it. Just from different places you can put that code and move it out of controllers, and then going from there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I just always hated about controller tests myself was that, A, I never wrote them, and so I felt guilty for not writing them. And B, I would write the unit tests, because those are typically pretty easy, pretty approachable, pretty straightforward to write. And then I would write end-to-end tests on the stuff that I really cared about. And that would be a blend of what you've called feature tests in your blog articles with Capybara, and using something maybe a little bit more heavy-handed like Selenium on stuff that I just absolutely wanted to know. I spin up a server and I bang on it and it does all the right stuff. And so, the stuff in the controller would just get tested as part of the overall run and not, tested on its face. The other ones that drive me nuts are like the routing tests and stuff. It's like, you know what? I can look at my routing file and for the most part decide whether or not it's going to the right controller. And the end-to-end tests will exercise that too. But I always felt guilty for not writing them because they were there. And so, yeah, that made me happy. I'm like, they're gone.
Yeah, and so there's not a timeline for it. They're soft deprecated. There are a couple pieces in particular that have been extracted to a compatibility gem. To be honest, I haven't looked at its gem spec to see if there are any version dependencies that aren't going to get updated at some point. But yeah, soft deprecation is still, if you're really dependent on controller tests, maybe start looking at other ways to test that code. And if you feel guilty about not writing them, then it seems like you're getting a pass.
Yeah, makes sense. So we talked a bit about them getting rid of those, and I kind of alluded to some of the solutions you put forward. But if you're not writing controller tests, what are you writing? How do you approach that?
So the pattern that I took is kind of what you just described, where I started moving a lot more toward higher level tests. So browser testing through Capybara, testing against APIs, stuff like that. And that works, and it's a good way to get test coverage relatively quickly, but it can also start to slow down your test suite if every little thing, that's how you're testing it. So getting down towards lower level tests, more unit test oriented coverage is a great way to start getting more coverage that isn't going to be so much overhead to get set up and run. So that's what kind of led to this part 3 blog post, was if we're going that route, what's the best way to make sure that that code that's in controllers still is getting the coverage it needs? And the answer to that I came out with was get the code out of the controllers and then test it more isolation.
That's interesting, because I think a lot of times our knee-jerk reaction is, how do I do the same thing I've been doing somewhere else? And so how? Anyway, I think that I just find that interesting. And David is really the deep thinker on the show, so I'm going to let him come in with the but, or maybe deeply agree. I don't know.
Well, I'm just the undisciplined thinker, so I'll come from a different perspective sometimes. But what I've liked about service objects is the testing specifically. People think about object-oriented purity or what should be, but I like to approach a project with, I understand what I'm trying to get, and I want to take some time thinking just about what the customer gets from me. What could go wrong? What do they get from me? And how do I know that I'm doing something of value? So in general, I'm always for service objects. I've known a lot of people don't like them. and I'm trying to understand why. I've been looking at Avdi's argument against it a little bit, and maybe you guys can comment on that and we can talk about reasons not to, but I have to have a pretty good reason not to use them before I hang them up.
Right. So this is the part where we're talking about moving functionality out of the controller and testing it someplace else, right? And so you set up the service object so that you can do that.
Yes.
Now, do you do that just for testability? Yeah, you kind of jumped ahead, but that's fine.
So pulling for me, the hard part about a controller having a lot of business logic in it is I have to go through the HTTP stack to go and take a look. Is it working? And that's a lot of repetitive hitting from the outside in, trying to see if the controller is behaving the way I thought it should. And it feels dirty and it's slow, and I end up spending a lot of time thinking about what's off. And I'm thinking about the wrong parts. I'm thinking about the controller instead of thinking about the business logic, and that confuses me.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page there, because that's how I started to get to this myself. Was I've got this relatively concrete piece of business logic that maybe doesn't make total sense at first, but as requirements become more clear, it makes more and more sense. And at a certain point, what I found was, that to test all those different things, even in a controller test, not even as an integration test, there's still a lot of overhead of going through that controller at some point to test little isolated bits of that logic. So extracting it into something, and I won't say service object or whatever you want to call it, because that's a separate part of this conversation, I think. But getting it into something that I can not just test more easily with different permutations, but reason about outside of the context of the whole MVC structure of my app was the big win for me.
That makes sense. I think the place that I really get hung up with service objects, or some other place to execute stuff, and I remember way back in the day the mantra was skinny controllers, fat models, and so it was move it into the model. But the model, I never really liked that either. And when I was new at Rails, it was mostly just I get confused here because there's so much going on, and I figured out later that that's kind of a smell, and that I should be looking for another place to put things. And I'll say that for the most part, then where a lot of this wound up was then on queues, and so it would wind up in some processing job. Was my form of a service object, right? It's like, oh well, it doesn't have to happen right away, and it's kind of a side, If the main app is the motorcycle, it's kind of the sidecar, and so it kind of it's part of the thing overall, but it doesn't need to be like a major part of the app. But even that never felt quite right for some of the stuff that I was looking at. And so anyway, this is a long way of basically saying that I look at the service objects, and I definitely, we're talking about Avdi's post, I definitely see his point where if you're creating a service object for every weirdo offside thing that you have to do, it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I mean, it makes it approachable for testing, maybe, but I mean, in his example, I didn't even like where he wound up either, because he kind of created a global service object, which to me feels like a junk drawer, and then it had a process IPN method on it that took the parameters from the request anyway. So it's like, okay, good for us. It's doing everything except for rendering the template. So it's essentially just a controller that the controller calls. It just doesn't do the routing, and it doesn't render the template. So what's the point, right? What am I getting from this? And so I'm kind of looking at this from a couple of different places and saying, all right, how do we arrange this, right? How do we put these into service objects or processing units of whatever kind that make a lot of sense? Because I don't want a global junk drawer, hand it the params kind of thing, but I don't know that I necessarily need a new service object for every extra thing that I need to do either, if that makes sense.
Yeah, one thing I like, and maybe you guys disagree, but using a service object inside of a controller, I tend to have code in the controller that handles the interface, that says, I know what I'm going to receive or what's valid, and I know what I'm going to give back or what's valid, and that's what the controller is about, and then it can pass in to a service object if it needs to. So I like splitting the params out of the service object, not because it's like the one right way, but that it helps my brain. Like, okay, I can think about an interface over here, and then let me come over to this other place and work on what the business logic should be. And then the thing I like about service objects themselves, at least the experience that I've had with them, I've written, I think, at least 1,000 service objects at this point for lots of domains. And at this point, I feel like what happens to me is I'll write the object and work with it and test it and feel good about it. And then after I get a lot of them, I start to reason about the business logic differently. In other words, by having them out separate in the app, I start to see that where I didn't see it before, and so by whatever means, having more confidence and more clarity is a really nice side effect. And I think that's maybe a little bit Weasley, because I'm not saying you should use service objects, but I like having the side effect of, hey, I'm starting to think about this differently. I'm starting to see the flows, the repetitive parts, the parts that I could probably do better, the things that I might have left out. And I'm thinking about the interface as a separate type of a problem to solve. And so at least I like the mental process I go through when I'm working that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it seems to me like that mental process, whether you agree with Abdi's approach or don't, you can still follow it to a degree because you're starting to pull that out from the controller, or maybe from within another object of some kind, whether it's you're trimming down a fat model, or you've already got a service object, but it's starting to get too big. To start to just keep pulling things down into not being small for small's sake, but being smaller to make them easier to reason about, like I was talking about earlier. And then I think testing comes out as a nice byproduct of that.
Another thing that reminds me, I like how you're thinking about that, because getting smaller can happen stepwise. If there's no one true way, and I see I have a problem here, but I'm not quite sure how I want to solve it. I can take just a little thing here, make a little bit of progress in the 10 minutes I'm going to give it today. And then maybe tomorrow I'll give it another 10 minutes. And it just gradually gets better tested, better understood. I can take a very difficult problem and break it down without having to say I have to do the whole thing and re-architect everything. And that's always when I get in trouble. I've gotten in a lot of trouble when I've tried to re-architect everything fast, and I can upset a lot of people and I can get it wrong. But if I can take small steps, that helps me as a developer.
Yeah, one thing that I'm wondering about a little bit is, you said, well, maybe just take steps. So, instead of just going and putting all of the procedural methods into one object, maybe you have a service object for each group of types of things. So, for example, I'm working on an app that helps manage podcast episodes. And it's not ready yet. That's why we work through a Google Doc when we line things up with Aaron. But, I'm getting there. And so managing certain transactions that have to happen, between an email server or the database or, other parts of the process for each step of the episode process, I could see moving a lot of that stuff over to a service object that's just about the episode process. And then if I have some other process for sponsorships or, some other thing I could see, so that way it is all grouped together, and, each part of the process is in its place, and belongs to an object. But ultimately at the end of the day, I don't have this big pile of methods that don't necessarily talk nicely to each other or don't mean the same thing to each other.
And one thing I've noticed, and Aaron, maybe you would disagree, but I've noticed that when I write a service object, there's a flow to it. I mean, it is procedural. And so I just kind of go in the natural order of the golden path of what could go right. And then I can look at what could go wrong, and I have tests for both. And so there's just small steps. I'll usually have 2 or 3 lines in a method when I'm working this way. And so it's easy to test and reason about, but it's also easy to say, what am I depending on to make this decision? So you say, I have to have this kind of information. This stuff's already looked up. I'm in this state. And so my next step in the procedure does make sense. And so I don't have big fat things inside of the procedures as well. I have small steps inside of the service object, which also makes it easier to reason about it.
Yeah, like I said, I think that's the big win is just starting to, if you can put more focus on what the little chunk of business logic is, then you start to figure those things out, right? So yeah, I agree.
And I like that too, because I mean, especially I've been looking at your book and really liking it. Congratulations, by the way. I write and I know what goes into writing a book. And so I'm really excited. I'll be using this. Thank you. But I've been looking through the way I mean, if you're thinking about this from a test-driven perspective, you start to, I'm sure, learn a lot of things. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what it's like, not just from your career, but in writing the book, of how you start seeing the code differently through this experience.
It's a good kind of full circle sort of tie back thing where the book came out of my own challenges, just kind of understanding how writing tests worked. I got started with Rails with the first version of the Pragmatic Programmer's book on Rails. And at that time, there was a chapter, I think, towards the end on writing tests. Since then, it's become a more integrated thing from the get-go. But so I knew that, when I run generate model, blah, 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 it creates an empty test file that I know I'm supposed to do something with, but I don't know what that is. So I just kind of let that go for a while. Someday I'll get back to it. And I got to a point where I know my application works pretty well. It's been in production for several months. And I get the occasional bug report and I fix it and we move on, but no test coverage yet. So the approach I took was, if I know my application works, or I'm pretty sure my application works the way it's supposed to, then I can write tests against that. And if something doesn't go right in the test, then it's probably something wrong with my test. It's not the application code. So it's kind of like TDD in reverse. And that's how I learned to write tests. I started small, which comes back to what we've been talking about. If you have smaller chunks of code, it's just easier to think about. And so I said, okay, I'm just going to focus on testing my models. I just focused on that, got that down pat, and then moved on up to controllers at the time and figured that out. And then on up to integration tests and figured that out. And once I had a decent understanding of how all those different layers worked, I was able to flip it around and say, okay, now I'm going to do outside-in test-driven development, start with a high-level spec, and then work my way down as needed.
So as far as time, it sounds like that's quite a process. How long did you feel like it took you to understand the stack well enough to do it to get to the end of that part of your career?
It's hard to answer that definitively because the first part of just writing a lot of Rails apps, a lot of small Rails apps, and some of them got used for real, some of them were just toys or experiments. But I'd say maybe after a year of that is when I really got into, let's start figuring out this whole testing thing. And then I'd say it was at least a few months, but it's very deliberate. As I was going through writing new things and going back and looking for things in my apps that I knew had been battle tested, were places that I don't have tests yet, and start to figure out how those wrote. I would say it was a few months of just kind of getting comfortable with all the different levels of testing, and then maybe a year of really deliberately going in and saying, oh, this part doesn't have good coverage. I'm going to add that now, and I'm going to really think about how that coverage should look and reflect on what I know so far. And yeah.
One thing that I'm wondering about is, some things are really hard to test, right? I'm thinking, testing integrations with external APIs, or testing my own APIs sometimes, or sometimes testing certain forms of authentication are tricky. So, how do you work through that? Or, are you kind of covering the more general cases?
So it's a little bit of both. What I try to do with the parts that are expensive that I can't stub out somehow, or it's just not a good idea to stub out a lot of times. Is try to write my tests so that those more expensive tests are relatively limited in number, so I don't have to run through some external service to run every scenario for my test. Maybe just one or two to test the happy paths. And then some of the more granular detail stuff I can test with the slow or expensive stuff stubbed out somehow.
That makes sense.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says "Pay me now." And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
I think I've had a similar experience too, where it takes a long time to really understand the whole stack. When I was learning Rails, I had a machine whose graphics card went out. So it was Linux, and I just reset it to run on command line only. And I learned how to write and test models really, really well. I didn't have a way to run on my laptop at the time. Controllers, there was no GUI. And so, but I found that changed my thinking around, you know what, I do like that part of it. Business logic is important, and the smaller things are easier. I feel like sometimes, even though the other's important, like Chuck was saying, some of the authentication problems, some of the full stack problems, trying to get those tested and fully grokked and feeling comfortable that I'm actually doing a good job with that is hard. And I found that too with training new developers or bringing somebody in on the team that doesn't have a testing practice, that we just try to start on the small. We try to make sure that, hey, the unit tests are good, they understand the business logic, and that they thought about what could go wrong. And at least if we can get that far, the code seems to be pretty stable. It's nice to have at least that much.
Yeah, I think good unit test coverage won't give you a fully tested application, but it can go a long way. And if you think about it in terms of the testing pyramid, there's a reason that unit tests are at the base, and it's wider than the rest. Is having that in place is a good, solid foundation for getting the rest of that pyramid built up.
Yeah, and if the rest,
because you both have talked about different levels of testing and different amounts of testing and different layers of testing. And what I'm wondering here too, and this is something that I've debated with people, and I've never really felt great about any of the answers, is at what level then are you comfortable that everything is going to work the way that you expect? I mean, a lot of people poo-poo the 100% test coverage. And so it's like, okay, what do I aim at then? Is it just most of this stuff? When you talk about, stubbing out certain parts of the application that may have to talk to external services and things like that, which makes sense to me. But at the same time, then I know that there's a gap there or a potential gap there, right? And so, yeah, how do you get comfortable with where your application's at as far as testing goes, so that you know that at least the critical stuff is covered and most of the other stuff is covered too?
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, because it is something you can get data on. You can run a tool like SimpleCov and see where the gaps in your test coverage are. It'll show you line by line of application code and say, oh, this branch of this conditional never got exercised in your test suite. And then you can look at that and make that decision. Do I need to test this at what level? Or is this something where the overhead in either writing that test or running it repeatedly, so you're getting that good feedback, isn't worth it? Or maybe it's such that, yeah, it is an expensive test, but it's also important, so I'm going to write it and then maybe not use it as part of the TDD feedback cycle, but as part of an integration level where, if it is super slow, maybe you run it in Jenkins or a similar tool and address failures from it there, rather than I'm going to use this as part of my TDD feedback, and when I do that, I'd like to get feedback as quick as possible and not wait 15 seconds for a slow test to run. So yeah, it's a little bit of knowing what data to look at, and then as you get more comfortable with the app and the business and knowing how the two work together, being able to make those decisions.
Yeah,
I like that. I like that answer. I think the only other thing that I do is, and I'm sure Aaron does, is we just, we know our app, we know our customers, we know if this goes wrong, how bad is that? I like, okay, I'm pretty confident this is good. And what happens to the customer if something were to go wrong? And so anything that really ruins a customer's day, that is worth the price, right? And then if it's like, they probably wouldn't notice, they probably wouldn't care, then I do some testing and I run through it and I keep an eye on it. But I try to figure out where to put my time based on the customer. And I think that projects that last a long time, that kind of thinking goes away and everything just gets better over time. And it's not about that, but sometimes it's about getting it out to the customer so the customer can use it too.
Yeah, and sometimes that might be part of the feedback, where something that you don't think is as important to test turns out your customers tell you otherwise when it behaves differently than they expect. And then, okay, so time to write that test and use that then to help drive, whether it's a bug or the feature worked the way it was designed, but not the way customers expected it to work, so you have to adjust it. But then you start to build that test coverage there. And I was, as you were talking, I was thinking a good concrete example of maybe a test that's important but expensive would be like testing against an external credit card processor, where if that fails, your business might be losing money, and nobody likes that. So. Kind of knowing what's important and what's not.
And it does seem too that's the interesting thing. I found that sometimes the most important things, they're not actually in the app, but they're around the edges of an app, like talking to a credit card processor or a bank or another external service where things can go wrong. And so then it's not so much maybe about the test, but about the architecture of the code. How do we know the state we were in? How do we recover? How can we make sure we can replay it and test it? Like make sure that if something went wrong, that we fixed it going forward. How do we see if it was right or wrong? So those edges, those are expensive edges that I find that they're hard because they're halfway outside of the app, talking to something else that has to work, that might not be available, or it might change or whatever could go wrong.
Yeah, but the thing is that I find that in a lot of those cases, if you set up some kind of procedural approach to it, right? It's if something goes wrong with payments, here's how we handle it. If something goes wrong with deployment, here's how we handle it. If we deploy a critical bug, here's how we handle it. And we know generally how we're going to go about attacking those problems. It simplifies a lot of that. I've kind of been working So I'm finishing up my How to Get a Job course, and my next course is going to be on systems and automation around your code. And it goes into all of this stuff, right? It's here are the 5 or 6 procedures that you're not going to write in code that you need to know. And then here are all the things that you should automate through continuous deployment, continuous integration, and stuff like that. And if you just know what those steps are, we deployed a critical bug. Well, what's the first step? Well, did it corrupt any data? Is it easily rolled back? Do we have a backup? And so you set these decision points, and then somebody, even your junior developers, can walk through it and understand that. It's hard to test that stuff, but if you know how you're going to approach it, then you essentially at least have a troubleshooting guide. And a lot of times that's what your tests are there for anyway. Oh crap, something broke. What broke? And then you start going in, you start looking at your tests. Oh, this test case is incorrect. Or we don't have a test case for this, let's write one. And you start to approach things and understand things that way. And so, yeah, I kind of see this all as part of the same process, part of the same procedure for writing code. It's just that the tests for your code are easily codified, and the rest of this comes down to the people, and that's a little bit trickier sometimes.
And that's interesting too. I've been thinking about how, like, if you have the procedures well understood so that you can handle these things, that's good. It tends to be a little bit of, from a business perspective, a little bit of that's the pressure point for the whole company. That's the part that we need to know that it's been thought through and done. I would just say that if there's a risk in an application, it's usually around this stuff. So it's important, but a few minutes of thinking ahead can help a lot.
So what are you working on these days, Aaron? Is it more stuff around this kind of thing, or have you kind of moved on to other topics?
To be honest, it's a little bit freeform these days, and yet things always seem to come back to tests or testing as a driving force of what can I do better in my code, because having well-tested code is something I value as a developer. So that's what got me thinking around this. There are some things around, you were just talking about things like deployment. What are things that I could do to improve my deployment process to make it not just more automatable, but the parts that are automated have some degree of testing. And I've done a little bit of that with, like, writing a test to make sure that Chef or Puppet is doing what it's supposed to do. Things like that. I work on a large old Rails app as my full-time day job. So a lot of what I think about is around that. So I think a lot about working with 10-year-old plus Rails applications and the challenges and opportunities that come out of that in terms of whether it's refactoring large controllers or just looking at such a thing as a history lesson. I listened to your interview with Justin Searles a couple of weeks ago, and just talking about how Rails conventions have evolved over time, and controllers are, a real indicator of that. If you can look at a controller and kind of guess, I bet this was written in 2007, and get blame, and sure enough, 2007. So just thinking about things like that. I've been thinking a lot about security, particularly in older applications where things that were conventions once upon a time have fallen out of favor and are now looked at as possible security vulnerabilities. So yeah, things like that.
Cool.
It doesn't seem to get easier, does it? Things get older, and they don't just get put on a shelf. There's always something to think about. Oh, there's security. There's new this. What? Oh, we didn't realize. And now we have the old code around that we'll have to update or think about differently.
Before I took this job, I was very much, this application is 3 years old, time to rewrite it, because that's what you do. But I couldn't even think of rewriting this app now as a single Rails app or dozens of microservices or however it wound up getting architected. So, and that's not something that the business I work for wants to tackle necessarily either. So it's a good opportunity to tackle that challenge of, okay, this code is what it is. Some of it's 10, 11, 12 years old at this point, and we need to make sure it continues to work and continues to be malleable to work with the new things we want to make it do. So, putting on that refactoring hat and just going at it head on has been something that I'm surprised to say that I've enjoyed doing.
That's awesome. I think that my experience has been the same with, hey, it's 3 years old. It's time to rewrite it. And, or let's let the next people rewrite it. I want to go do something new, greenfield.
Yeah, that's the actual answer.
Yeah. But I do think that having the courage to refactor and being able to pay attention and to know that it's a job well done. Here's the new functionality and things are moving in a good direction, and being confident as I deploy code. There's a craftsmanship to that and a clarity. And as far as bang for the buck, I think that that's a lot of value add. That we don't have to go rewrite everything and do a major effort when we can just be clear and work our way stepwise into a better solution.
Well, and one thing that I see with this, as far as refactoring older, larger, I guess mature Rails apps, is that with these tests, especially if you come at it from the feature test or the end-to-end test, or however you want to approach it, what it really comes down to is, now I have something that, as long as the path helper doesn't change, which has been pretty consistent since Rails came out, or, the couple of other places where, Rails gives you a helper that may break things. I mean, that's much less brittle than, say, controller tests, where you run the upgrade and then all of a sudden all your controller tests, we got to pull in the gem that backfills this feature, and how do we handle it? But then the other thing is you have those guarantees, right? Because materially your app isn't going to do that much that's different from what it currently does. And so you're looking at it and you're going, hey, okay, so I need it to keep doing what it's doing, but I need to upgrade it so that I get all the security benefits and things like that. And so I, just kind of bring it full circle on this stuff. There's a value to going with whatever the current state of the art is, and there's a value to having these sorts of sanity checks in place so that that, hey, everything's handled. We know what it's supposed to do. We know that it does it right, and it's done in such a way that is not brittle from one version of Rails to the next.
I like to think that it's my job to be clear and thorough. And I think that's what you're saying, Chuck, is that if I'm clear and thorough, I'm good. And that's why I want to write tests. That's why I want to come up with some solution inside of my application that I can be clear what I can and can't do. And I'm thorough. It's good. I can, I can hang my hat on that one.
Yep. And then just doing it in a way that is both clear and thorough, but also adaptable to what's going to come in the future as much as we can, because we can't 100% know that, but a lot of times we can be aware of what's going to come.
That's an art I've noticed. Sorry if I'm cutting in here, but it's interesting because older senior developers, we tend to have an opinion about it. We're not necessarily right, but what stays the same and what changes is there's an art to that. And including people in and understanding, hey, we're doing this because I think I'm going to get a new feature request here, or I think that this is where things change over time. And so, It's like the hidden thing that I've had a lot of people ask me, why are we doing it this way? And I realized I never explained that. At least I thought, I probably wasn't right, but at least I thought that these things are always going to be the same and these things are always going to be changing. And so we're going to try to build a system that can accommodate that.
Yeah, I was going to say, historically, a lot of this stuff changes in the same places. Those are the things that they're iterating on to try and get right. And so, yeah, just by saying, you know what, we're building this in this way because we want to be adaptable over here, and we're making the assumptions over here that, that's not as likely to change, and so we can, specify in a different way what's going on.
Yeah, that sounds like every project ever that I've worked on, where you make those guesses, you make those bets, and a lot of times they pay off, and a lot of times they don't, and it's just part of doing what we do, I think.
Yeah. I like the idea that architecture is just lines and boxes. And so we'll put a line between things that should stay the same and together and things that will change on the outside of that line. And then the boxes inside that line can kind of be built away, okay, yeah, this is probably what I want here. I just architected probably a major project for me, just for my own podcasting. And I noticed that's how I was thinking about it. Like, oh yeah, these things will change, so let's organize and create something this way. And it just comes natural, I guess, after a while. And I think also, because I was thinking about, okay, how do I test this? And again, okay, that's how I'm going to design the system then. Is it testable and do the stable parts get delivered, and can I fix the other things later?
Yeah, and I love the idea of just testability, going back to kind of the topic of this episode, where it's, okay, this is hard to test, or, the way that we test is changing, and you know what, maybe we move stuff off to service object, maybe we move things off to something else, maybe we can move some of that logic into the model, and ultimately at the end of the day, it makes it easier to test, it makes the code easier to approach, and I find that testability is often a surrogate for clarity in the code. And so it really makes a lot of sense. We're not just talking about, we want all the feel goods with the code. We do, but it's also that part of, if it's easily understood, then it's easily tested, and vice versa. And there's a relationship there that, just makes things really easy.
That's a great way to put it.
I like that.
All right. Well, I'm going to push us into picks. My 2-year-old keeps hitting buttons on my computer. So,
for you, the listeners of Ruby Rogues, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription at lootcrate.com. Just enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Loot Crate is one of my favorite things. Every month I get a box in the mail, costs less than $20. And it comes with all kinds of goodies. I have stuff from, just looking at my shelf, Batman, Spider-Man, Ninja Turtles, Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and much, much more. So if you're a geek, a gamer, anything like that, and you want cool stuff to put around your office, cool t-shirts, comic books, etc., then definitely check out Loot Crate. To save 10% on your new subscription, go to lootcrate.com/Ruby. Again, that's lootcrate.com/Ruby to save 10% on any new subscription. Enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings.
David, do you want to start us off with picks?
Yeah, I'm in a mood these days where I want to kind of expand my brain by relaxing my brain. So I've been reading a lot of fiction, and I'm having a lot of fun with Ready Player One. So that's about to come out in a movie. Probably by the time that this episode comes out, it'll be in the movie theaters. But I'm reading the book and enjoying that, and I recommend it. It's a good, fun book, and I do think that relaxing the brain and having a well-rounded experience gives me a better edge as a developer. +1,
terrific book, and I definitely see the value of leisure. I'm going to jump in here, and I'm going to kind of back up your pick with another pick, which is another book, incidentally. It's called The 12-Week Year. And one of the things that they encourage you to do as part of your 12-week year, and actually have it scheduled in, is a breakout block or breakout time every week. So they talk about different time blocks, and you have like buffer blocks, which are basically make up time for the stuff that you didn't get done that you planned that week. And then you've got strategic blocks, which is where you work on kind of the critical stuff in your business. And then they have the breakout block, and the breakout block is where you kind of take that leisure, right? And they make you plan it in for a few hours every week, and it's just kind of one of those critical bits of stuff that come into play. They've also got me planning my week now, so the last couple of days I've actually gone and worked out every day, and I've been pretty deliberate about waking up early. And by early, I mean at 4 a.m. Now, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I don't have a lot of choice because I have to take my dad to dialysis. But, it kind of pushed me to, on the other days of the week, get up at 4 a.m. to just get into that rhythm. And just being in that rhythm and setting yourself up so that you can get right into things and, run ahead with the stuff that you have going on, I'm finding is really, really critical. And so, today I got up, took dad to dialysis, came home, helped the kids get to school, took them to school, went and worked out, prepped for this episode, which I actually had scheduled for yesterday, but I had to be a little bit flexible because I had some other stuff come up. And, after this, I'm planning on working on the remote conferences and things like that. And so anyway, this is all to say that, planning some time, and especially planning that leisure time and the strategic time are really, really important. And then the last thing that I'm going to pick is the Ruby Hack Conference, which is in Salt Lake City. Now, David, I don't know how familiar you are with it. Eric's talked about it a bit, but I am going to be speaking at the next one. So I'm excited about that. I haven't spoken at a conference in I can't remember how long, a couple of years. I tend to go to the conferences and interview the speakers for the shows. This is my shtick. So this will be a little bit different. My talk is on blockchain with Ruby, and it's one of those, I really want to learn about this, so I'm going to submit a talk on it. And then it got picked, and so now, deer in the headlights. But I've been having a blast the last few days just digging in and seeing what the capabilities are with that. So if you want to come hear that talk, I wouldn't doubt that they're streaming it and stuff too. But come out to Salt Lake. It's a great place. You can meet David and Eric and I, and it'll be terrific. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and pick that conference. I'll quit rambling. Aaron, what are your picks?
Well, I've got 2.5. One sets up another one, if that's cool. So the half pick is a repo that showed up on GitHub last week called No Code. I'll find the README real quick. It says, no code is the best way to write secure and reliable applications. Write nothing, deploy nowhere. And if you look at the repo, it's got a license, a README, contributing file that says don't contribute. And yet there are thousands of issues opened already, a few hundred pull requests, and a lot of them are really funny to read through. So, the no code repo, but what that sets up for my real pick is something that I've been working on in the last couple of weeks is deleting code. I've kind of got a reputation on my team as being the one who will just submit a pull request with 40 insertions and several hundred deletions. We talked about the challenges of maintaining older code bases. This is one of those things that can help you make it a lot easier, where the less code you have, the less code you have to maintain to keep secure, stuff like that. So deleting code is my real first pick. The other one I wanted to mention is a podcast that I really like. I know that programmers stereotypically don't always like sports, but it is sports related. It's called 30 for 30. It's by ESPN. They've also got a documentary series called that. But the stories aren't always, they're sports related, but they're not about nitty gritty of sports. So the most recent episode was about how the Madden football franchise came to be and how they really pushed the technology at the time to be able to support full teams on both sides. That was something that they initially couldn't do, so they held off for a while. And it was really interesting from both a sports fan perspective, but also from a programmer perspective. And they're not all about technology, but take a look through their back list. There's only about 10 or so episodes, but really interesting stories. So yeah, those are my picks.
Awesome. Now, one last thing that I'm wondering is if people want to follow you on Twitter or GitHub or, we found you through your blog. I mean, what are the best places to see what you've got going on these days?
The blog everydayrails.com is is where I'm doing most of my writing. I don't write nearly as much as I used to, but where I do write, it's there. And from there, there's links to email, or Twitter is everydayrails as well. Those would be the best places.
Awesome. And I'm sorry, everybody, for the crying 2-year-old. My son is at a therapy assessment, and all of my other kids are at school, and my 2-year-old has a cold, so she's co-hosting, I guess. And she keeps trying to play with a half-full Rockstar that's on my desk with all my computer equipment, and I keep telling her to leave it alone. So anyway, so that's what's going on. Well, thank you so much, Aaron, for coming and joining us.
You bet. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right. Well, we will wrap this one up, and we will catch everyone next week.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
With fewer tears. We will catch everyone with fewer tears.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.